Welcome back to Our World. Mental illness is one of the most difficult stigmas to deal with in the black community. So, what can be done to break the cycle that may be preventing proper diagnosis and treatment? Joining us in the studio are psychiatrist Dr. Janet Taylor, mental health advocate Michael Denzel Smith, and Celaya Abrams, author of No More Drama, 9 Simple Steps to Transforming a Breakdown into a Breakthrough. Thank you all for joining me. Dr. Taylor, I want to start with you. We've seen so many statistics come out over the last few decades. For example, African Americans make up only 12% of the population, yet they make up 25% of all mental health needs. We see suicide rates going up, depression rates going up. What's going on in our community?
Well, what's going on is not just our community. Statistics show that over half of Americans have a diagnosable mental illness or disorder, but most don't get treatment. And the same thing holds true for the black community. We may have issues of depression, but we think it's a sign of weakness. And so we really haven't made the connection between a diagnosable mental illness that can be treated and actually going to have care, understand we need to lose the stigma so that we can function better for ourselves and our family.
Speaking of stigmas, we have a sort of cultural thing around church, around community, around school, trying to avoid mental health issues. Michael, what do you see as the principal reason why we walk away from mental health issues without addressing them?
We view it as a personal weakness. We choose to suffer in silence because we believe that's strength, and we have had to adopt strength as a defense mechanism and survival technique.
So what's the first step, Celaya? I mean, when we first have, as you call it, a breakdown, what should we do as black people, or as anybody, but what should we do?
The first thing that anyone needs to do when going through a severe depressive episode, which is what I had experienced, is to be able to reach out and get help. You have to first acknowledge the truth of what's going on. But, you know, aside from the general mistrust of the medical profession in our communities, there's a huge amount of emphasis placed on game face, holding it down, keeping it together. And too often you see people who are willing to suffer in silence rather than to break that code of silence and admit that they need help.
Well, that's an interesting thing because, Michael, you talked about in your own writing your journey through the issues around mental illness, and you talked about not just how difficult it is as a black person, but particularly as a black man. What were some of the issues that you confronted with it?
There's no one that looks like me who is talking about their journey through mental health disorders. Recently, Ron Artest, who at the end of the championship says he has a psychologist, and like people are laughing about it because we don't, you know, it's not something that I've heard all the time. Black men don't go to therapy, they go to the barbershop. When I was going through my depression, the only people that I knew that went to therapy were in Woody Allen movies. And they're all white people, you know what I mean, that are crazy. And we need more people that look normal, that are living with the mental health disorder instead of they are the mental health disorder.
Can I just touch on that? When you mentioned about normalizing, in my particular instance, I was suffering from a personality disorder. For people to say that if you suffer from a mental illness, that somehow you're crazy, that's the first thing that needs to go. We need to stop putting that label on people and allow it to be seen as a normal spectrum.
But that's sort of part of popular culture too, right? I mean, we have haunted houses that have people escape from the mental institution. We tease people who, you know, who are crazy, so-called crazy. We have movies about people who are so-called lost their mind. I mean, this is part of our culture, right?
We believe they can't function.
Right.
We believe that they can't function in normal society and that they're somehow a drag. And we have to erase that because there are so many of us that are going through it and going through it silently. If we present images of people that are living with it and going through it and coming out of it and functioning normally, then we can break those types of things.
I'm sorry, but movies talk about sociopathy and psychopathy primarily. Those aren't curable disorders. And I know you can speak more about that.
But I think the media does do a disservice. But on the other hand, I think also when people are depressed or have bipolar disorder or personality disorder, they will self-medicate with alcohol or drugs or do something else before they go see someone. And so in many cases, it's easier to say I have a problem with drinking, I have a problem with drugging, than I have, you know, schizophrenia or I have bipolar disorder.
But how much of that is not just people choosing alcohol over medication? How much of it is about people not having resources, whether it's money, whether it's knowing what doctor to go to? I mean, how much more difficult is it for poor black people to get mental health care?
It is difficult, but resources are out there. But you have to open your mouth and you have to ask. So access alone is not the issue. But I'll tell you one thing. Even once people access the system, 75% of people don't come back.
Why don't
Well,
people...
that's a million-dollar question. Do they not feel welcome? Do they not want the diagnosis? Do they not have money for medication? So, I mean, that's where the real barrier is. It's one thing to access the system, it's another thing to keep people coming back.
We live in a culture that wants a fix now. Alcoholism, of course, is a great escape route. I mean, I've been in recovery for 16 years. I know that when I was younger, I would go and see a therapist and keep drinking, not wanting to give up the alcohol. You think it's easier to drown yourself in a bottle or to take pills or to get lit and not deal with the issue, which in and of itself creates a whole other issue.
Speaking of medication, we actually have a question from one of our viewers that deals exactly with this issue that I'd like you all to, respond to.
Hi, my name is Erica Jones, and my question for you all is, do you think that more children are on ADD, ADHD medicines because the diagnosing criteria has changed, or because it's easier to deal with children on medication than it is to counsel them?
What do you all say to that? I mean, African-American children we see are largely medicated, some say over-medicated with things like Ritalin and other drugs. What's that about?
It is about an over diagnosis and over medication. The diagnosing criteria has not changed. ADD, ADHD is a real psychiatric diagnosis, but unless the criteria are followed and unless they have the complete neuropsychological exam, they may have allergies, they could have thyroid disorder, they could have a medical problem. We should not be medicating our kids.
Moving into the sort of hardcore nuts and bolts of this, on the ground, Michael, if you were talking to teachers or if you were talking to parents and you were wanting to give them some instruction on how to identify or respond to their children who may have mental health needs, what would you tell them? What should they do? What should they look for?
Well, the thing I tell people, I wish somebody would have told me I wasn't crazy. That's the first thing. Like, don't attach any shame to it. Approach it with the same love and care that you would when they have a cold, a sniffle, a headache, a fever. That same approach, it works for when you're dealing with mental health as well.
That seems to be the key here, dealing with it with care and also dealing with it publicly. So I'm glad you all were able to come here and have a public conversation about this, and I hope we can continue to move this conversation forward. I promise you all to come back again so we can continue this conversation. Absolutely. Dr. Janet Taylor, Michael Denzel Smith, and Salai Abrams, thanks so much for being here.